Robert, thank you for the opportunity to come along tonight and talk about Charles Todd. Who's heard of Charles Todd? Okay. Who associates him with the Overland Telegraph? Yeah, pretty well all of you, and that seems to be the case. I guess you are, with due respect, an older demographic. And people who've heard of Todd tend to associate him with just that one particular project. Now, even his own daughter, Lorna, referred to him as Telegraph Todd in a series of articles she wrote for the Chronicle in the 1950s, and the first one came out on the 4th of December 1952. But Todd had a career that spanned 64 years, and of that 64 years, both in England and in here, that's how much the Overland Telegraph occupied. Now, it was certainly a very important project, as this slide will tell us, that it's referred to as being possibly the greatest ever accomplished in Australia, and I think that's arguably still the case. But I'm going to take this opportunity of his 200th birthday, which is next Tuesday, and this was as close as we could get to it, so thank you for fitting me into the program there. I am a little disappointed there's no cake though, but never mind. But it's the thought that counts. Now, there's a great deal of misinformation about the Todd story, and of course that is only going to get worse as we have the affliction of artificial intelligence conjuring up all sorts of stories out of not very much. I'd like to start with one, and that's his name. And the next time you're having a quiz night, you might like to try this question. What do these two men have in common? On the left is the character Jack Reacher, created by Lee Child, the 6'5" soldier of fortune, as portrayed in film by the 5'7" actor Tom Cruise, which is coincidentally about the same height, as I've been able to establish, as Charles Todd. So, what do they have in common? Height, yeah, good one. Okay. No middle name. And certainly Todd's middle name is not Heavy Tree. In fact, it's not anything. And this has been given all sorts of currency by people. As far as I can tell, thank you to Trove, after filtering through lots of newspaper accounts, it seems to have bobbed up like the soldiers of the Dragon's Teeth up in Alice Springs in the 1940s. And I haven't been able to attribute it to anyone, but it's been picked up and been run with by a number of people since then, including one of Todd's, I think she's a great-granddaughter, and that's Alice Thompson. She is, after all, a journalist, and she came out here some years ago with her husband and followed the Overland Telegraph and produced the book, The Singing Wire, and that sucked me in at first. I thought, well, if anybody should know, she should. She told John Healy of your society that it was something she found in family papers, and when we asked her to if she could find those papers, she said, oh, look, I'm just moving house and I'm not sure where they are. Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I took her word for it, and then I started to dig a little bit, and I got a copy of his birth certificate. And the interesting thing about this is you can see just up there, let me highlight that for you, the clerk who was writing out the certificate thought there was going to be a middle name. And when he learned that there wasn't, he took the opportunity of filling in the rest of the line and leaving it with no doubt that his name is Charles Todd. The other thing that this birth certificate tells us is that the family home was in Church Street at Greenwich, and that's where his father Griffith conducted a tea business across the road from St Alpheg's Church, referred to as the Old Church, because it was founded in medieval times and Henry VIII was baptised there. And this is possibly the basis of Todd's most famous pun, "Without my tea I would be odd." That's a lovely picture of the Naval College, and just up there in the corner is the observatory. One of the mudlarks, the people who fossick around in the banks of the Thames when it's at low tide, has in fact found this little relic of Griffith Todd's grocery business, and this was something that his great-grandson, Stephen Gillam Smith, sent to me. Stephen's been working away, lives in London, and as part of his contribution to the recognition of Todd's 200th birthday, he's been researching the early life in England of Charles and Alice, and he has been a very helpful source of information. So let's have a look at Greenwich. There is the old church, and the Todd grocery was just across the road, pretty well facing the church. The building's not there today. If you go down to the side of the church, you will see along this street, Rowan Street is the school where young Charles went to school. And also in this illustration is a very important feature, and that is the Greenwich terminal station of the railway, because running alongside it is a telegraph line, and that will have significance later on. The Astronomer Royal, George Airy, had secured funding to employ people to perform the tedious calculations needed to transform decades of astronomical observations into useful tables that could be used for navigators. And on the 6th of December 1941, young Charles started work at the observatory as a supernumerary computer. And there were about 5 or 6 lads who'd been taken on with this funding that Airy had secured, and they had to sit there crunching numbers and turning a couple of 100 years' worth of observations into useful tabular data. When the funds ran out after 3 years, so did the work, and we hadn't really appreciated this until Stephen had started to delve into it this year, that Charles then didn't have a job. And we don't know what he did for probably about the next 12 months. Remain a mystery. Perhaps he worked for his father, we don't know. But then in December 1845, there was an opportunity that cropped up at the observatory again, and that was a position with James Glaisher, who was the superintendent of the Department of Meteorology and Magnetism. And it was Todd's job to undertake astronomical and meteorological observing duties. And it's answered a question. I wondered how Todd became such a competent astronomer, and I had assumed that just simply working at the observatory, he would have had the opportunity and probably even the encouragement to learn something about the work of the observatory. But in fact, he was specifically employed as an assistant to Glaisher, who was regarded as a pioneer, particularly of meteorological observations. So that job didn't last all that long. The funding dried up, and this time Todd asked for a recommendation for the position of a junior assistant at the Cambridge University Observatory. Glaisher was very pleased to give him a glowing testimonial, and Todd joined the staff there on an annual stipend of £70. He also had an introduction to a local family, the Bell family. It was during one of his visits there that young Alice made her famous utterance that one day she would marry him. In May 1854, George Airy offered Todd the position of an assistant at Greenwich, which, along with the observatory duties, included supervision of the newly formed galvanic department. Now, this is quite an impressive piece of modern technology. At the heart of the galvanic apparatus was this master clock. Beautiful clock, long case clock, pendulum of a metre, which meant it had a period of 1 second. And this was one of the new pieces of technology because it was electrically regulated to keep up a steady beat. And once you've got electricity into the system, by running lines to other pieces of apparatus, you can have slave clocks that keep perfect synchronism with the master clock. And they could be anywhere. You could run a wire, and there were master clocks elsewhere in the observatory. And on that little display board next to the clock, they've put in 2 slave clocks, and you can see they've actually run some wiring indicating the signal being fed from the master clock to the slaves, and they could be in the next room or in the next building or even in the next county. And I was visiting there with the curator of horology, Rory McAvoy, and he was trying to explain to me how the subtlety of this electrical regulation operated. And he said, look, hang on. And he went off, came back with the gloves and a key, unlocked the case, and set the master clock going. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you like to share an experience with Charles Todd of hearing and seeing the master clock at work? And you can see the second hands moving around in synchronism. So that was the background to Charles Todd's days at the observatory as supervisor of that apparatus. And the whole point about this is that, as I said, wherever you could run those wires, you could have one of the slave clocks or some other piece of apparatus. So, for example, from Greenwich up to the Strand in London, there was a time ball in the streets that could be dropped at 1 o'clock, and probably just as importantly, down there on the coast at Deal, there was another time ball, and that was there specifically for the navigators of ships to ensure their chronometers were synchronised. And they were able to go that far afield because they were using, Airy made an arrangement with the railway company to use their telegraph line to send those synchronising signals. So that's what Todd was responsible for in that position as superintendent of the galvanic apparatus. Now, as you can see from that display board, it's really a pretty simple circuit. There's a battery, some sort of switch to control the current, and then some device that's connected to it. And in the case of the telegraph, that would be a little solenoid that would operate a ticker or a sounder. It could also be things like the relay that released the time ball at those stations, like in Deal and in the Strand. But then there was another device that was actually around probably about 20 years before the telegraph, and that was the electric arc lamp. So when Todd came out here to Adelaide, stories about electric light had been appearing in the Adelaide papers as early as 1849. And people heard about Todd, who's come here, this fellow who's got all of this new technical knowledge, and he wrote to the Register in April, on the 15th of April, and he said it was his intention shortly to make some experiments in conjunction with Mr. Cracknell. Now, Charles Edward Cracknell was the one assistant that Todd brought out from England with him. And yes, he did give that demonstration, but it wasn't until 1860. But he did have some other things to do between now and then. And nevertheless, Todd became recognised as being a source of scientific information. And in fact, he was referred to, and he even referred to himself, as the government electrician. Now, that didn't mean that he would go into people's places and fix PowerPoints. An electrician in those days was a scientist who was actually working at the very top of his game. So to be referred to as an electrician meant that you were really right up there with the latest scientific knowledge. When a biography of Todd was finally published in 2017, Professor Dennis Cryle called it the many worlds of Charles Todd. But as one myself, I was very disappointed that he completely missed this aspect of Todd, the electrical engineer. So I was very pleased that the Society gave me the opportunity of correcting that and getting onto the record in the 2020 journal an article about Todd's very significant contributions as an electrical engineer. Not only did he give that first demonstration of light in Adelaide, but he also became a recognised national expert, and he was chair of a committee that drew up the first technical regulations for electricity distribution, and some of those regulations are still in force today. So it was a pretty significant contribution. This is his letter of appointment, and this was the newly created post here in South Australia as Astronomical and Meteorological Observer and Superintendent of Telegraphs. So telegraphs were actually third on the list of Todd's duties. This letter of agreement is dated the 22nd of February, and he had quite a lot of prep to do before he came out here, not the least of which was to get married to Alice. And there's the young couple on their wedding day on the 5th of April 1855. And at the reception, in his response to the toast of the bride and groom, Todd said he hoped he would be instrumental in bringing England and Australia into telegraphic communication. And it's something, it took a while, but it really did happen. But that was part of Todd's vision right from the start. Whether it be the line up through the middle is another question altogether. Stephen has pointed out that in this hand-tinted photograph, the gold chain that Alice is prominently displaying and also her ring have been picked out by the tinting artist in gold leaf. So the original in colour is actually quite spectacular. The Todds departed from Gravesend on the 29th of July 1855 in the Irene and reached Port Adelaide on Monday the 5th of November 1855. And this is an extract from the Bill of Lading. This is Todd's luggage, 2,379 items. And then also somewhere in there was Alice's piano and a few other things. Not quite as spectacular as it sounds, because 2,225 of these items were iron pipes, which he had brought out here in order to lay cables underground. But it's still a pretty significant manifest. 30 of the cases contained telegraph apparatus and one contained meteorological apparatus. And in fact, that was one of Todd's duties when he got the position at Cambridge and also working with Glacier. Glacier was a noted meteorologist and a founding member of the British Meteorological Society, and Todd was later elected a fellow of that society in 1885. But one of the things he started doing was compiling and publishing in the local newspaper weather observations. Quite detailed observations. They weren't forecasts, they were simply reporting the weather and the measurements that he'd been taking of it. And out here, quite quickly, by the 10th of November 1856, the Register said, "We have much pleasure in publishing the first instalment of a new series of meteorological observations by Mr. Charles Todd. Nothing of the kind has been published here for many years, and the attempt to introduce a more comprehensive system of observation reflects great credit upon Mr. Todd. We hope that Mr. Todd's efforts will be well supported by scientific observers in this colony, of which, however, we need entertain very little doubt." 7 weeks later, this is one of Todd's reports. Now, bear in mind the size of the type in the colonial newspapers. It was a case, I think, of being careful what you wish for, because the Register now said, if the reports of Mr. Todd could be presented in a more condensed and less elaborate form, they would be more useful to the public. even if less interesting to scientific calculators. We certainly think that Mr. Todd's labours would be more extensively appreciated if his calculations were summarised and published in less minuteness of detail. Thank you for the vodka and tonic, Robert. Now, Todd also took the opportunity, he had those meteorological instruments that he brought out with him, and he trained his telegraph operators to also take meteorological observations. And these combined with observations, now as the telegraph spread, observations were coming in from other parts of the colony and of the country. And from that, he was able to understand the weather patterns across the entire country. And this is one of the first of his synoptic charts, which was published in 1879. And it provided information about the weather systems that covered a greater area than any other part of the world. And that data is still being used today by today's climate scientists. The charts, along with daily weather reports, were posted, and you can just see it here, weather reports on this little stand in the great postal hall of the GPO. Now, Todd, because he was getting data from such a wide area, was starting to understand the weather to a much greater degree than anyone else. And in fact, he was the first person to realise that the weather systems in Australia went from west to east, and not from east to west, had been thought up to that particular point. And he was also, with some readings he was getting from India, to build up a pattern of what's known as the Southern Oscillation Index. Todd is credited with being the first to report that phenomenon, and that gives the indication of the development and intensity of El Nino or La Nina events. So he was very much a pioneering meteorologist. Needless to say, when a spell of bad weather came along, Todd was somehow held responsible for what he was simply reporting, but gave Chinner an awful lot of fun. As if he didn't have enough to do, the government decided from the 1st of January 1870 to add the duties of Postmaster General to his responsibilities as Superintendent of Telegraphs. It was a cost-cutting measure. It had already been done in New South Wales and Victoria. There was a bit of an uproar because John Lewis, the Postmaster General, was a valued public servant, and you can see from this little notice here in the Government Gazette that he retired. And they felt, however, that Todd was better able to come to grips with the administration of the postal service rather than Lewis try to understand the technicalities of the telegraph. As it transpired, Todd actually acquitted himself very well. And at the time of Federation, the South Australian Postal Service was the only one that had been operating at a profit. It also had the distinction of being the first in the world to issue a postage stamp depicting the GPO itself. And Todd thought the halfpenny green, which we're seeing here, was the most handsome stamp produced in the colony. Now, a critical factor in the production of postage stamps is the perforations. So this is John Bradley Cook, who was in Todd's department as the printer of stamps, and he thought that he could address this problem because the perforations have to enable you to tear one stamp from the sheet, but not to make them so fragile that they start falling apart in storage and handling. So there's quite an art in working out the size and the spacing of the perforations. These were applied by a machine, and Cook thought he could design and build a better one. And indeed he had such a model, so there's the perforations. And he was having trouble with it, and Todd weighed in on the discussion about how big and how far apart the perforations needed to be for optimum performance. No detail was too small for Charles Todd. Now, that position of Postmaster General is recognised in the Adelaide Marriott on the 14th floor in the southeastern corner with a lovely view across Victoria Square and down at the Victoria Tower, is their postmaster's suite. Now, the late Laurie Wallace, when he heard about this, pointed out that any town could have a postmarket, even, as Todd himself famously remarked, Orroroo, which only had 2 letters. So you could have postmasters left, right and centre. There was, however, only one Postmaster General. And Paul Gallup, the General Manager of the Marriott, agreed with that. Paul takes the heritage of the building that he manages very, very seriously, and he had the sign changed to the Postmaster General Suite. He told me it cost $800 to have that little sign changed. When you think that that room costs $4,000 a night, I really don't think it's much of a problem, do you? Money well spent, I'd say. Now, Todd's primary duties, as harking back to his job description, was that of astronomical observer, and a couple of years after his arrival, Adelaide was treated the site of a very beautiful comet. It was visible actually in the western sky for about a month, and Todd thought this was the one that was last seen on Earth in 1556. However, he said, not being possessed of proper instruments, I've been unable to make any observations for determining the position of the splendid comet now forming so conspicuous and interesting an object. So he was the astronomer, but he didn't have astronomical instruments. It did take a while, but finally the Todd's home and the observatory was constructed, and here we are looking down Franklin Street towards West Terrace, and right at the end of Franklin Street is the flagstaff that signalled the arrival of ships in the Gulf. And looking at that picture, you can sort of understand why, yes, you could see across the plains down to the coast. And the Todd's home was just around the corner. This picture was taken in early in 59, 60, I think, and the home wasn't ready for occupation. But it wasn't the one we tend to think of. It was described as a small iron house with a transit instrument borrowed from Victoria. Now, transit instruments were highly accurate tools that were used to establish the important parameters of time and location, and the two are inextricably linked, and if you know one, you can find out the other. Now, I do apologise for some arithmetic, but here we have the globe that makes a rotation of 360 degrees, and it takes 24 hours to do it. So that means that each one of those meridians that's shown on that diagram corresponds to a 1 hour difference in time. So if you've got and you have to have a reference point for all of this, and the one is the prime meridian at Greenwich, and if you come forward 10 of those segments, that's 150 degrees to the east of Greenwich. That puts you somewhere between a line between Bathurst and Lithgow. Then you know that that is 10 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. And by doing these calculations, if you know what the time is relative to some standard, then by taking observations, you can work out where you are, and likewise, if you know exactly where you are, then you can use these same calculations and observations to check the standard time. And all of this is really fundamental to navigation, and that was what was helping Britain to rule the waves. Because the important thing, the big challenge, and Dava Sobel, some of you might remember the series she did on television a few years ago, and a couple of books that talk about the importance of and the challenges of establishing longitude. But using the transit telescope, Todd was able to take observations, and you can see, say, there's a little star coming across the field of vision, and once it hits the graticle, he could note the time that he made that observation, and then by performing calculations, so that was 15 minutes past 8, he could use those tables that he himself had contributed to calculate what the time should be, because the stars are pretty regular, and then he could correct the local observatory clock, and from that master clock all other clocks could be corrected as necessary. The main place where the correct time was displayed was, of course, on the 4 dials of the GPO clock, but that clock wasn't ordered until September 1873. Todd had a hand in drawing up the plans and specifications. The tenders were called for in 74, the bells arrived in January 75, and the clock mechanism in August, and Todd himself assembled the mechanism of that clock, and that was set going just before midday on the 13th of December 1875. In the meantime, the populace had to make do with a clock in the postal hall and time signals that were transmitted throughout the colony over the telegraph at 1 o'clock each day. And a year or so later, a time ball was erected at Semaphore. Todd had actually shown a model of the mechanism, which, as best we can tell, he actually made himself in 1869. But he had this, it was tested on the 2nd of August 1875, and the ball was dropped by a signal from the observatory at West Terrace. Now, as I said, the converse of this time and position is also true. If you can get an accurate time signal, you can work out exactly where you are. And Todd employed this technique in 1868 to determine, with the assistance of the government astronomers in Sydney and Melbourne, the accurate location of South Australia's eastern boundary, which was proclaimed to be 141 degrees east. Now, at this stage, there we are looking at the Murray. There's a telegraph line linking New South Wales and South Australia through Wentworth to Sydney, and Todd camped somewhere here on the northern bank of the river, set up an observation station with a transit instrument, brought in a couple of lines from the telegraph line, which was a little further to the north, and then by observing the clock stars, he was able to send a signal to the observatories in Sydney and Melbourne, and then they could record on their master instruments the time at which he made the particular observations, and from that he could work back to the exact latitude of his telescope, and from there he could measure across the ground, chain terrestrial surveying methods to the actual border, which was found to be 2.5 miles too far west. So there it was, and you can see the difference between South Australia, the farming practices, and Western Victoria. The government astronomer, George Smalley in New South Wales, agreed with that calculation, so New South Wales shifted their border. Victorians wouldn't. And that led to what is known as the disputed territory. And in 1874, somebody estimated the value of that strip of land, the difference between those two meridians, to be £800,000. And the claims dragged on for years. It went to the Privy Council in 1914, and they ruled in favour of Victoria. So there's another thing they've pinched from us. To mark the province boundary, just up here, and you can get to this, it's a little bush track, and they erected this wonderful brick obelisk Originally it was much taller than this. It was 13 foot 6 high, and it was well up above the flood line, and that indicated the true position of the border. Interestingly, before Todd can perform these calculations, they had to be satisfied about the exact locations of the observatory in Sydney and Melbourne, and they were found to be inaccurate. Todd had to take some sort of average. And this has been the case with some of these geospatial measurements, that as measuring systems have become more sophisticated with global positioning systems and satellite systems, any inaccuracies have been thrashed out, so that even in Greenwich, the prime meridian, in fact, was found to be actually 100 metres further to the west, out in the car park somewhere. Todd did finally get his observatory, and complete with a tower and a nice stately home, and to the north of it, in that open field, you can see there's a number of meteorological instruments. They're all designed to provide standard conditions for measuring temperature, but allowing the free circulation of air. And the one on the right, the little one, that's the modern Stevenson screen, and Todd actually introduced some improvements of his own into the design of that screen. And there he is in the early 1900s, probably 01, 02, with the glacier stand. And the weather records that he compiled are recognised as being the world's longest series of parallel temperature data. And again, very valuable input to climate change. Todd's great love was astronomy, and he eventually got his wonderful equatorial telescope, which was installed by the end of 1874, which quite literally opened up the heavens to him. You'll notice this has got a dome which rotates. You can just see here the dome turned on bearings that were cannonballs left over from the Crimean War. And Todd said it showed that cannonballs could be used in peaceful revolutions. Todd took great delight in showing off the observatory. They would have conversations in the observatory, and he would often take the opportunity to perform what one report described as a number of very beautiful experiments in electricity, and these were static discharge things that made lovely sorts of patterns and looked quite spectacular. Well, I've got this far without saying too much about the telegraph, but we've seen something of what Dennis called the many worlds of Todd. There was stargazing Todd, you've got weatherman Todd, you've got, to borrow Lorna's phrase, telegraph Todd, the government electrician. We've got Postmaster Todd. No, we haven't. We've got Postmaster General Todd. Starting to sound a bit like a Spice Girls reunion, isn't it? So I asked myself the question, was there a sporty Todd? And to some extent, yes, he definitely did have interests. We know he was what John Howard would have described as a cricket tragic, and he was often seen at Adelaide Oval in the company of Sir Edwin Smith. He was patron of the GPO Cricket Club, where his employee players included George Giffen, and at state level he was on the board of the South Australian Cricket Association. One of the other rather surprising things, Carolyn Spooner, who late of the State Library, found this delightful little cartoon which referred to Todd driving a buggy to pace a racing cyclist. So yes, he did have sporting interests. In 1893, just after he'd been knighted, the acerbic Gawler Bunyip said, "I don't know what he does not go in for unless it is pugilism and bicycling." Well, we know from this about bicycling, and as for pugilism, this is how the cartoonist for the Portonian chose to depict Todd in a bare-knuckle match against the British Australian Telegraph Company with Sir James Ferguson as his second, determining and settling the question of where BAT would land their overseas cable. But Todd actually was more at home on the chessboard, particularly seeing it lended itself ideally to play games via telegraph, because you could send its cryptic notation. E5, for example, means that the bishop moves to square E5, and Todd made the telegraph available to chess players to play matches over the telegraph in the other colonies. And what's depicted here in the town hall, you can recognise the magnificent organ behind it, is a match with Todd and John Mann. This, I think, is Todd sitting there at that chair, and their moves on that chessboard were relayed to people who moved around that square. Carolyn, the game was reported in detail, of course, and Carolyn showed the moves to a chess expert who rated it as a very good game, at least A level. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Charles Todd, the family man. Stephen sent me this rather charming picture that one of the relatives had. It's not in particularly good condition, but there's young Charles with their first child, Gwendolyn Elizabeth, later known as Lizzie. She was born on the 12th of March 1856. We were a bit thrown by the colour of the baby set being blue, but of course the notion of blue for boys only became a thing in the 1940s and the 1950s. The Todds had 6 children, and this is a nice family group taken at the observatory. And I've got my cheat sheet here. That's Maud, that's Lorna, that's Gwenny, and that's Lizzie. There's Charles Todd Jr., Charles Edward Todd, who was a doctor. That's his wife. And up here is Hedley Todd. That's his wife, and that's her sister. And the 2 girls at the front are her children. And of course, sitting here, standing at the back there, is Gwenny's husband, William Henry Bragg. And here at the front is their son, William Lawrence Bragg. And of course, the 2, father and son, are famous for winning a Nobel Prize for Physics in not sure when, didn't write it down, never mind. Here, the other young lad is their other son, Robert, and he would actually be killed at Gallipoli in 1915. And if that wasn't a large enough family, when Alice made her one trip back to England in the 1860s, she came back with, this is one of the nieces, Frances Todd, known as Fanny. In 1869, George Griffin Todd Jr., their nephew, came out here. He trained as a telegraphist and actually went to Darwin as the assistant station manager for the Overland Telegraph. Then in 1869, Alice's widowed mother, Charlotte, came out here, and this is the only image we have of her. It's a lovely little family silhouette taken in Christmas of 1842. That's actually Alice standing there at Mum, and sitting on Mum's knee is baby Henry, who actually didn't survive much beyond the following year. But Charlotte came out here, and you can imagine the size of the household. You can understand when Alice advertised in March 1877 for a boy to help by cleaning knives and boots, he also needed to be able to milk the family cow. Todd received what many believed was a much overdue knighthood in June 1893, and in January 1905 he finally retired as head of the Post and Telegraph Department. Astronomy remained his great love, and he stayed on as government astronomer and meteorologist until the end of 1906, at which point he retired and then had to move out of the observatory, but he continued to set and mark the astronomy questions in the surveyor's qualifying examinations until 1907. He moved to rented accommodation at the east end of Angus Street, east of Hutt Street, and he was just around the corner from where Gwenny and William Bragg lived. And some people think that Todd actually unveiled the foundation stone for that building, which in latter years has become home for the Public Schools Club. In January 1910, as was his wont, he took a couple of weeks to go down to Semaphore. Apparently he liked to sit on the seafront and watch the shipping go backwards and forwards, and it was there that he suffered a massive clot in his leg and he died a couple of days later. On the 29th of January 1910. He's buried in the North Road Cemetery next to Alice, and that's the dual headstones in the centre, and on either side of them on the left is where Charles and his wife are buried, and on the right is Hedley and his wife, and that little stone on the ground here in front is for Lorna. And as the youngest daughter, it was her lot to become her father's carer. Sir Charles is remembered in a portrait of him that was painted by John Upton, and it was presented to the family by his staff on the 23rd of December 1886. They took it back to their home at West Terrace, and then after they moved out, Dr. Charles donated it to the university, and it wound up on the western end of the postal hall in the post office. And when that was stripped out for the Marriott, or what became the Marriott development, Telstra spirited that away to Melbourne, where it is locked away safely, they assure us. But there were moves afoot, and we're rather hopeful that it'll come back for stage 2 of the GPO development, where we can find a home for it. There's another portrait which the art gallery have securely stored in their basement. They did get it out for me when Stephen Gillum-Smith and his wife were out here, and we had a little viewing of that. Couldn't persuade them to put it on display for his birthday, but it's there in storage, and I guess that's where it'll stay. Many people think it's a pity he missed out on a statue, but there kind of is one. If you have a look at the GPO and what we see here, this was originally the entrance to the courtyard, and this point on to the north was an extension of the GPO that was built in 1893. And if you have a look up there at that top window over what was Charles Todd's office, we will see Charles gazing down on Adelaide, a city that he did so much for, and devoted a huge amount of his life towards playing a part in its life. Amongst his civic duties, Charles Todd joined the Library Board, and he's still on record as their longest serving member. And I missed out with the art gallery, but I was able to persuade the State Library to put on a Todd exhibition in their Treasures Wall that will open next Tuesday, Todd's 200th birthday, the 7th of July, and it will be there until the 30th of August. So you will be able to have a look at the artefacts and the documents that rely from Todd, and I'm very pleased to share some of his aspects of his working life other than that telegraph. Thank you.